What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Poker Distilled. The topic this week is fortune reversal. This is a really common phenomenon at the poker table. I think what we should do first, Melissa, is just outline what this actually means. And then I believe you have an example from the weekend that you want to share as well. So what do we mean when we talk about fortune reversal in poker?
When I think about fortune reversal, I think about it as you're in a hand or a spot where you have the best of it. You have really high equity. You are expecting to win the pot, and something happens that immediately shuts it down and causes you to lose. So a bad river card, a turn card that brings in an opportunity for your opponent to harvest more equity by hanging around, things like that. And I think actually when I think of fortune reversal, I think of like a very dramatic, like a drastic, like change, like the river card that gives your opponent a set or something, like a binker, something like that.
Yeah, totally. I think when I think about fortune reversal, what I'm really imagining is that you have a really amazing hand that has massively high EV, like maybe you flop a set, and then somehow just multiple bad things happen to the point where your EV gets reduced to something close to zero. So you have like a really terrible situation following very quickly from an amazing situation. And then the challenge is to like adapt to the fact that the situation is now terrible. Like maybe you're value betting a king high flush with 3 streets, and then your opponent jams the river or something. And now you're like, wow, my king high flush that was this massive EV harvester has now been demoted to the lowly rank of bluff catcher. Right. And I need to figure out whether I can even call now or whether I have to fold my hand. And it's like trying to adapt to that sudden plummeting of your prospects that occurs so quickly is a really difficult challenge. In fact, I think it's one of the most difficult challenges poker can really throw at us. So I believe you had a couple of instances of this at the weekend when you were doing your usual grind.
I did, yeah. The first one was I had flopped a full house with pocket threes. The flop was jack 3 jack, and I was on the button, and under the gun was the pre-flop raiser, and essentially I was betting out, and then we were both really deep, and we got to the river, and the river was a deuce, and I bet, and all of a sudden he jams for the rest of his stack, which was like he had like 800 big blinds. Like we were both really deep, and I'm thinking to myself, I had a boat, and all of a sudden I'm in this terrible predicament where I'm in this spot where like there's so few. I felt like there were so few hands that he was beating me with.
Can we quickly just recap the board just for the audience again? So
sure. So it was the flop was jack 3 jack. The turn was a 5 of spades, and then the river was a deuce of hearts.
Okay.
I'm sorry, it was a deuce of diamonds. And so a pretty innocuous board, I would think, even if he has a jack. I mean, he was betting out. I don't exactly remember how the action went, but essentially I was betting, he was calling. And then on the river, he suddenly bets out with the rest of his stack. And my thought process, the way the hand was going, was that, in his range were ace jack, king jack, possibly pocket jacks for, quads, but certainly nothing like jack 5 or jack deuce that would beat me with a bigger full house. Well, when he jams on the river, I'm suddenly in a spot where those things are possible. And I didn't know much about this player, but it didn't seem like he was the kind of person that would, fire this as a bluff. I mean, it was certainly possible, but it didn't seem like it was predominantly what was happening. So anyways, I ended up calling, and it was jack deuce. So he had raised under the gun with jack deuce of hearts, and then hit the deuce on the river for a bigger full house. And that was I think it was a very odd spot, and it was something that doesn't happen very often at all, thank God. But it was a certain situation where I recognized, okay, this is a shitty spot that suddenly turned bad on me in a really dramatic way. And I'm not even talking about whether it would be necessarily good to fold there or not, or whether I can't fold there or whatever. But my point is that for the sake of our conversation today, that situation was a situation where I was not able to think clearly. I was not able to kind of soberly analyze the situation because it was such a dramatic change and it was so unbelievably unexpected. I mean, it's always in the back of your hand that your opponent can jam on you when you're playing no limit, obviously, but the times when it does happen, and especially in a river spot like that where you have a boat, is was quite unexpected. Second time was last night where I had pocket kings, like under the gun +2 early position. I open, I get like 4 callers, which is very common at low stakes, and villain was on the button, and the flop comes 8-8-4. I bet out 30, roughly a third pot. I probably could have gone larger, but I did a third pot. Fold, button calls. The turn is a 4. So now the board is 8-8-4. I bet 75% pot, and button raises me. He min clicks me. I call. At that point, I thought he definitely has some 8s in his range, but he also could have some smaller overpairs, some other things going on. I call. The river's a king, so I binked the boat on the river, and the board is 8-8-4 king.
Mm-hmm.
And so obviously I'm thinking, well, if he has an 8, he's got a boat, and is he ever folding a boat? He was also heavily intoxicated, so I'm first to act, and I just jam for the rest of my stack. It's like I also was really deep that night too. 700 big blinds. He also had around the same, and I just never would have gone that large in that spot against most players. But because the situation, I sensed that he had a boat and it would be almost impossible for him to fold, that was a situation where I could get in. I could justify such a large overbet in a river spot where really my only value was kings, or I don't know, maybe some weird quads or something. But so he thinks and he calls, and I won that pot. And so I think with this fortune reversal concept, is it can certainly work against you, and it sucks when you're in that spot like I was with the jacks or with the pocket 3s. But if you recognize it happening to someone else, it can be an opportunity to harvest additional chips in a spot where maybe they would be more prone to fold. Like if he had just had, like if the board hadn't paired, if there wasn't a 4 on the turn, and perhaps he just had like a naked 8 and it was just like he just had trips or something, then maybe he could have found the fold despite the fact that he was also heavily intoxicated, but he wasn't like a total fish. So I think he possibly could have found the fold if I just jammed all that money. But the fact that I went so large was I thought was the fact that this is not a person, and very few people can fold a full house on the river.
Yep. Okay, so where to start with this? So fortune reversal. In the first hand, yeah, I mean, just because we've said so many technical things about this hand, the audience is probably like wondering, thinking about what they would do and things like that. It's not normally our remit here, but yeah, I think folding in the first hand is like really, really difficult. You had pocket 3s, right? And it's like jack, 5, 3 deuce or something like that. Or
no, the flop was jack 3 jack. The turn was a 5, and the river was a deuce.
Yeah. So you're losing to like 5s and quad jacks, or like some really bizarre jack 5 suited, jack deuce suited, or something like that. Yeah,
right,
so
which is what happened.
Yeah, so folding there feels like really bizarre. I think it would be like an absolutely heroic, like ridiculous fold to make, and you'd need to have some kind of like concrete read that the merging in his range, like the jamming of the jack there, was like non-existent. If there's any chance that this guy's jamming ace jack, king jack sometimes at a frequency, then folding here is kind of ridiculous. There's any chance he has deuces, folding is ridiculous as well, although that seems kind of unlikely. But yeah, I think the first hand, you're right that when you face that ridiculous huge overbet on the river, your hand gets demoted like most of the way to bluff catcher. Like most of the hands that you're beating just aren't playing that way. And then you've expressed that it was really impossible for you to think clearly, and that's totally right, because it's like feeling like a rabbit in the headlights at that point. So the main thing that we can do with fortune reversal is acceptance. I think this is step 1 in actually processing these kinds of spots, being able to say, this spot is exceptional in that the change in my EV is massive and unusual and acute, and I have to accept that and process that before I can really make sense of the spot. Because why do people think so hazily and panic-strickenly in these fortune reversal spots? It's because the old impression of their EV is still there. It's kind of like when you look at the sun and then you look away and you can't get rid of the impression of the sun. You're kind of stuck with that in your field of vision, whether you like it or not. And in order to get that to go away, you have to really wait, and you have to blink a few times and look around and let your eyes adjust to the new surroundings. In this spot, there has to be like a really distinct processing period where you just basically sit there and do nothing. Don't even try to deliberate yet. Just try to process the fortune reversal. And if you can get to the point where you're like, okay, I have now fully accepted that this is now a really low EV situation and my hand is close to bluff catcher status, well, if the spot is a fold, and I'm not saying that it is, but if the spot is a fold, at least you've opened the door to somehow being able to access that sometimes. Like, you're now viewing your hand in the right light, where you're no longer being seduced by it and putting it on this pedestal that it doesn't deserve, but you're seeing it for what it is. So, for example, in Villain's case, in that 8-8 whatever board, 8-8-4-4 king situation, when he sees this gigantic all-in 7x pot donk or whatever it was on the river, there's no way that he can see his 8 as anything but a hand that chops or loses now, right? There's just like no way this is ever a hand that an 8 can beat from you, like in any circumstance. But he has to actually process the fact that he's never winning before he can even decide whether this is like a chop too often, or whether you actually just have kings all the time, or quad sixes, fours, sorry, whatever the other pair was, or whatever. I actually think the second hand is a fold, like in a pretty clear fold, technically speaking, for Villain.
Okay.
And that's just because, but that said, I wouldn't expect many people to find it. So I think you've done a really good job of finding a spot where if you make this absurdly large jam, pool should fold an 8, but won't. And therefore, you just make an absolute ton of EV from that. You're basically getting pool to call in a situation where they're always losing, effectively. Because I don't think you'd ever play a chop like that, actually, in reality. No. I think your range is literally quads if you haven't played it differently earlier, and then most likely just kings full. 3 combos of kings full is the entirety of your range in that node. So, yeah, I think Villain should fold. And I think it's a hero fold, but I think it's a good fold. But I don't think anyone's going to find it because of fortune reversal. Like, if we trace Villain's thought process in this hand, he's kind of like, oh wow, I have a really big hand on the flop. On the turn, I have this monster. I'm going to make this milking min click back because I don't want Melissa to fold. And then I'm going to go for a big bet in the river. Then the river lands and it's like, bam, in your face 8x pot, like ridiculous jam. Maybe you can check jam, by the way, because an 8 still value bets, remember? Just got to be that nerdy guy. I got to throw that in there. Maybe you should check jam this spot,
No, actually. I think that's interesting because it went through my mind. It went through my mind. And I don't want you to get off what you're saying, but I can tell you a little bit more about my thought process. But on that, did you want to keep going what you were saying about that being a...
Sure. I'll finish this thought process first, then you can elaborate more on your thoughts. So basically, when Villain then faces this 8x spot or whatever it is, he's faced with a near impossible practical challenge as a human. Like, firstly, he has to take in the fact that your range is no longer repping anything that he can be other than a bluff. So that's the first thing he has to process. And that's a really big pill to swallow. That's like someone giving you a fucking bar of soap and being like, right, once you've swallowed this, we can talk about the next steps in the procedure. It's like, I'd rather just not have this procedure. This is awful. I have to swallow a bar of soap first before you even do anything else to me. It's like a horrific thing to go through, right? So the brain is faced with a choice. It can embrace reality and all of the horrible, bright, nasty, scorching light that comes with that, and feel the burn of it and accept it and live in that painful truth, or it can and and paint some nicer landscape and, you know, get the palette out and draw a nice pink sky and say, well, you know what, she might just have a 4 and be overplaying it. That's never fucking happening. You never have a 4 there. Like, in no world do you ever play any hand this way other than a king. It would be, other than kings, it would be absurd for you to do that. But Villain has to see that. And it's not that Villain can't see that if Villain's a reg. It's not that Villain doesn't have the technical competency to see that. And it's not that if somebody else showed Villain that hand, that he might not be able to go, well, actually, don't you just beat bluffs here? Or chops? Yeah. Is that not all you actually get any of the pot against? Is a chop or a bluff? Well, how often is she playing an 8 that way? Once you start logicking it out,
Yeah.
He's just dead, right? There's no way he has
Yeah.
like the
Absolutely.
48% equity he needs to break even
Right.
there. He's like totally dead.
Right.
But he first has to look at the sun and accept the scorch of it and like see the world for what it is. That's the first
Right.
challenge. And it's easier to hide in denial at that point. The second
Yeah.
challenge is having swallowed that bar of soap and gone through the first awful part of the procedure to then be able to get through the next part of the procedure, which is perhaps even worse, which is actually reasoning and thinking calmly while all this turmoil is going on. If you can get through the second phase of the procedure, which is thinking calmly when you're feeling like dog shit because your hand that was meant to win you a big pot is now a bluff catcher in an unbluffed situation, you then have to get to step 3, which is actually having the fortitude, discipline, and guts to fold. We've talked before about this in the podcast, about how it takes way more balls to fold in a spot where you have a really good hand than it does to like bluff it off or call off your stack or whatever. Way more guts are required to make the fold here than to make the call. So it's the multiple hoops problem. What are the chances that I had toast for breakfast this morning? Okay, reasonable. I don't know, 1 in 3, something like that maybe. What are the chances that I am wearing a pink shirt and had toast for breakfast? Well, now you're talking about like 1 in, I don't know, 3 times 1 in 16 or something like that. Don't even know if it's 16th if my shirts are pink, even though this one kind of is. And then what if
Mm.
you said, well, now there's a third hoop you've got to jump through as well? What are the chances that I had toast for breakfast and I'm wearing a pink shirt and tonight I'm going to watch a certain Netflix show? Well, now you're in the realms of just like, no, that's not happening.
Yeah.
There's no way all of that is happening, right? That would be like winning the lottery. So for Villain to actually conquer the adversity here and make the fold that's correct, he has to jump through 3 hoops that are really difficult to jump through, and most people just don't have the stomach for it, plain and simple.
Yeah. 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 There's so much there. I think that before I forget, I wanted to just touch on the question of whether, I could have checked to him in that river spot and allowed him to bet out and then jammed over the top.
Mhm.
And my thought process was, because I'm in a fortune reversal spot, like it felt like, okay, this is from Villain's perspective. What will be harder for him? What will be a bigger, harder bar of soap for him to have to swallow? What will be a harder pill, if you will? Okay. Me jamming my entire stack, donking, or checking, he bets out pot or maybe a little over pot and I jam. Okay. And I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but my thought process was, what spot is more underbluffed, I guess you could say. Okay. Check raising on the river, at least in my pool, is a highly underbluffed spot. Okay. Perhaps the most underbluffed spot, if I could pick one. Okay. Very few players have bluffs in that spot. And I'm not saying that he may have not thought, okay, this is Melissa and she may have bluffs here, blah, blah, blah. I wasn't getting into that level of psychology, but I thought just as a kind of comparison between, what will be an easier spot for Villain to fold, what will be easier for him to take this pill, I thought the donk jam would be a harder pill to swallow. And it may have been wrong. But in the moment, I mean, it did work, but in the moment, that was the kind of thought process that was going through my head.
Yeah.
And I think for purposes of our discussion today, when you're, recognizing those spots, recognizing that fortune reversal spot, recognizing that this is a spot where your opponent, in order to make the highest EV play, the correct fold, whatever it is, has to jump through multiple hoops that are absolutely antithetical to how humans think and how they expect to be rewarded when they're given when certain inputs happen. So this is what is so tricky and difficult, and I think challenging about the fortune reversal spot. And one of the things that I think is a real, can really improve your game and your EV if you can, you don't have to master it, but if you're at least aware of it and you can overcome it, is this idea that you're really working against every instinct that you have as a human being, especially when you're stuck. Because when you're stuck in a long session, this is what happened to me on Friday when that Jack Deuce hand where the Villain showed up with Jack Deuce on the river. When you're stuck and you see flopped full house, when you see a flop set or a turn set, even better, every dopamine sensor in your brain just starts firing off, and you're just like, great. And there's that line in Rounders that I really love where Matt Damon's like, all I was thinking about was Vegas and the Mirage, right? Like this idea that your brain just goes to this spot where it's like, okay, now a session that was going to be, that was going to leave me down 3 buy-ins is going to be, I'm going to be even, or maybe it's going to be a little bit of a winning session. And all of a sudden you're just thrown into this new universe of things are going to be okay. This is a very dramatic example, but it's almost like being told that disease you had, you're better, like, or we found a cure, or like you're no longer, you're no longer going to suffer. And then it's like, whoops, actually the cure is wrong. The vaccine didn't work, blah, blah, blah. So it's a very, very difficult thing. And I'll be honest with you, in that spot with the Jack Deuce River card. And I don't know if this is the exact greatest example of this from my perspective, because it was such an unusual spot and it was just so weird. But regardless, I think what matters is not the result, but the thought process. And my thought process was absolutely not at all optimal in that spot. It was like a car that was just like, on its last legs, like smoking and, just about to explode. Like I was not clearly going through, okay, what's his bluff to value here? Any of the things that I normally think about when I'm thinking clearly. So I think being able to divorce yourself from that positive outcome, being able to accept that your fortunes have irreversibly changed, and that image that you had of the session going well, pulling yourself back from being stuck, all of these things that, your brain was telling you was going to happen are not going to happen. And that you are now in this new world, which is even worse than the world you were in before this hand started. Yeah. So instead of being stuck 3 buy-ins, now you're going to be stuck 4 buy-ins. Now what has turned into what has been a profitable week is going to be, not a profitable week. And that's really hard to accept. And I think being, like I said, like if you can master that, or if you can get it, if you can wrestle that and get a hold of that, I think that's a really powerful skill. And it's something that very few players, in my opinion, can do.
Yeah, it's the skill of being able to say, this is awful, but what's best from here? Like I'm in the awful part of the tree, whether I like it or not. I'm on the awful branch. The branch I was on way up there, that's gone. I can't get back there at all. So what's best from here? Do I keep climbing, or do I just fold and like jump down and accept all of the loss? Like, what do I do? And as you say, it's so psychologically difficult to process the fact that you're down 4 buy-ins. Now you've invested a buy-in into this pot, and someone has shoved another 4. So now you have the choice of being down, if you fold, down 5 buy-ins overall, or down 9 if you call and lose. And then there's this like glimmery hope that, well, if I call and win, I'm even for the day. That's so good. Like that's almost irresistible. So it's not just the fact that we don't want to accept the fact that we're on a terrible branch of the tree and like everything's losing and we've put extra money into the pot. It's also this hope. It's this like prospect of like, well, if I call and win, all my problems are gone. It's like the snake oil salesman comes to your house, back to your terrible disease metaphor. It's like, oh, hey there, you're suffering from a terrible disease. I can see from your face. It's covered in these horrible purple welts. I have magic lotion for that. It's only $1,000. Why does snake oil salesman actually succeed sometimes? Because of desperation, right? It's desperation that gets people to act in certain ways. Think about scams, right? When someone phones you up and they're like, your credit card has been used in illegal operations. Like the people who fall for that, who buy that, there's not many of them these days under the age of like 78, I don't think. But the people who do fall for that, why do they just give out their card details on the phone? Because they're doing anything they can to alleviate the disturbance, to alleviate the fear of what's just happened and the looming disaster. So when we're panic stricken, when we're faced with these untenable situations, that's when we act our most rashly. And I think that the reason your thought process was like the breaking down car here that was about to explode was really just because poker had put you in the most impossible situation for a human, the most absolutely impossible. And the people who can come out of that in one piece, and that's not me, by the way, because when I'm in situations like that, I tend to crumble. I'm really bad at fortune reversal. I'm much better at it than like most of the people I teach because I've just had more experience and I've been there a million times, but I'm nowhere near as good at that as some of the really top players in the world that you watch play live and make gigantic folds They're in a
Mm-hmm.
tournament, they're the chip leader against like the second chip leader. They get into this enormous battle of the big stack situation. Almost all of the stack goes in, and then someone makes a miraculous fold on the river and manages to keep a 35 big blind stack instead of a 10 big blind stack.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes all the
Mm-hmm.
difference in the tournament
Mm-hmm.
and nets them an extra
Mm-hmm.
300k or an extra
Mm-hmm.
million or whatever it may be. And that's the kind of thing that separates you as a world beater mental game wise if you're able to
Mm-hmm.
actually do that and overcome fortune
Mm-hmm.
reversal. Most
Mm-hmm.
people, when they start playing the game, like when they come to a coach like me for coaching at first, they have no ability to handle fortune reversal. They're basically like a sitting duck. They're just waiting for it to ruin them because they get into the fortune reversal spot. And then I look at their thought process, we go over the hand, and we realize that there's a 0% chance they were ever finding the fold there. And maybe in the future, in 2 years, there'll be a 10% chance, you know? Then in more and more
Yeah.
spots, they'll slowly begin to like process the minor fortune reversals. They'll get a bit better at like folding a flush on the river against a jam when that's not the nut flush. They'll
Right.
get better at that, but they're still not in a place where they're folding like the eight there in that situation that you talked about or something like that.
Yeah.
So there's different
Yeah.
degrees of fortune reversal, and maybe
Right.
the easier challenges are good training for the harder ones. So maybe in like a minor fortune reversal spot where you're value betting top pair and you get raised on the river, that sucks, but it's great training for all of these really big pots that are going to be thrown at you in your career where you've got
Yep.
to make really epic heroic folds where people are never bluffing in the real world.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. And the degrees of fortune reversal is important because I think the two examples we just discussed are very kind of extreme
Hmm.
examples, but I think every session you're faced with some degree of fortune reversal.
Yep.
It would be unusual if you weren't. You would have to be running, in my opinion, really well not to be in the spot. I mean, I think at the low end, probably the most kind of like minor version of it would be you have pocket queens and the flop comes out ace king
Yeah,
or something like that.
absolutely.
Um, and you're in a spot where it's like, and if it's a 3-bet pot or even worse, a 4-bet pot or something where you're just you just have to accept the situation has drastically changed. Your hand has been drastically demoted. That big pocket pair that you've been waiting for because you've been card dead for 3 hours is now a tease and the worst kind of tease, and you're going to have to accept that. And that's I'm not trying to toot my own horn or anything, but like that's something that like you have to be able to do. Like you can't have, in my opinion, like you can't have, and I'm not, I used to be that student that you talked about. And I have brought several, I in the past had brought several hands to you where you just basically in the cold light of day, we analyzed them and you just we quickly came to the conclusion that like, is villain ever bluffing in this spot? Sorry, Melissa, you had aces, but is villain ever bluffing in this spot?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, when you call this huge jam, like, what are you expecting? Like, what are you expecting to the result to be kind of thing? And it took multiple times of those cold light of day, like wake up, think about the hand for the next 48 hours because it's so clear to you after the session is over and you've gotten a night of sleep or whatever, how just an absolute like 100%, almost 100% fold that is, and you weren't able to make it. And I think that has to happen to you enough times to where you are like, where you have that kind of armor to where you can understand. First of all, you can be aware that you're in a fortune reversal spot. You can divorce yourself from the pot and you can divorce yourself from your hand and from whatever riches and glory you thought that hand was going to bring to you. And this isn't a cash game. I can't even imagine doing this in a tournament. I
Mm.
mean, this is a totally different, we don't talk about tournament poker
No, that's the dark
here,
side. We
but
don't like
we don't go there.
those
Yeah,
people.
we don't go there. I know tournament poker is all the rage right now because it's the World Series, but for us in the normal world, we don't talk about that.
Psychopaths.
So psychopaths, exactly. We're real poker players. I'm just kidding. The But being able to divorce yourself, all of those skills, like you have to get like, in my opinion, like you have to learn, you have to get whacked so many times before like your instinct just is dulled to the point where you're just like, okay. And the flip side of it is too, is that you also can't be so pessimistic and so affected by it that we're like, you hear this all the time. This is a classic old man coffee comment where it's like, well, of course I have queens. Of course it's going to be an ace high flop.
Mm-hmm.
Of course there's going to be a king on the turn. Of course. It's like, that's like the stupidest thing ever. And, that's how obviously like not a very good reaction, but my point in all of this is like being able to soberly analyze the situation, being able to react and take the highest EV move is something that you have to be able to do, I think, in a one of those minor fortune reversal situations, because it's going to come up again and again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you're the old man coffee type that's going, God damn it, there's a king on the turn every goddamn time I open jacks, and you're doing this, that's probably good.
That's like a combination of old man coffee, also GTO nerd.
And Joe
Just
Biden, a little bit of Joe Biden thrown in there as well. Yeah. Oh, goddamn race on the turn. The problem is that if you're someone that complains and laments about that, and it's not just old men coffee who do that,
Yeah.
I've decided the plural of old man coffee is old men coffee and not old man coffees, then it's good evidence that you can't handle even the most minor cases of fortune reversal. You know, if you're the kind of player that's like, every time I open queens there's a king on the flop, that's because it hurts you so much and you're so unable to process it that it dominates your psyche. It's like if you're afraid of spiders, you're going to remember the time the spider fell on your face. There's no way you're going to forget that. But because I'm not, you know, spiders have probably fallen on my face a few times, but I don't really remember, right? So whatever we're most afraid of, whatever we can't process logically and can't accept and come to terms with, that's the thing that becomes biased and crooked in our memory. Now, I've just finished the From Stalling to Mauling coaching series with Jess that you probably checked out on YouTube. And one of the biggest things that we had to deal with was fortune reversal. But Jess has a very particular type of fortune reversal that she doesn't like dealing with. And it is actually the really mundane ones where like the ace comes when she's got kings, or she has ace king and misses the flop. I've never known a student that notices so much when ace king misses the flop. Because she'll literally be like, of course I missed the flop again with ace king. This is beyond a joke now. Or say something like that. And it's like, well, you're meant to miss the flop most of the time with ace king. But if you, like, that's even more minor than having kings and an ace coming. Having ace king and not hitting an ace or a king, that's going from usually we don't hit an ace or a king to we haven't hit an ace or a king. That's a good place to start. So if you struggle with fortune reversal, that's a really good place to start. Can you come to terms with the fact that your ace king didn't hit a pair? No, you can't come to terms with that, right? Okay, so you need to start there. Let's slay this dragon, you know, so to speak. Wouldn't be the podcast without Petersonian references. So let's slay this dragon before we move on to the bigger ones. Okay, great. So you can handle it when your ace king misses the flop, and you can deal with that happening a few times in a row. Cool. Okay, now how do you feel when you have kings and an ace comes on the flop? Are you able to sit there and feel okay about the situation? Here's a good one. Are you able to pick up kings and not get your hopes up? That's a really good sign. Can you pick up kings, open the pot, and just have a sort of aloof atmosphere around you of, okay, this is a good hand, but very often I don't win with this hand. What will be, will be. Let's see if I can play it right. If you have that, that's the right attitude. If you have, finally, my savior, my problems are probably going to be over. I've been waiting for you my whole life. Now everything will be okay. You will anesthetize my pain. If that's your thought process, you're screwed, man. You fucking screwed.
Well, think about it this way. People, I like to watch documentaries about cults. Like, I'm very interested in cults. I'm not in a cult, but I find it I just find cults fascinating, and I find people who are attracted to cults to be interesting, and cult leaders to be really fascinating. But anyways, the common thing that every person says is, that could never happen to me. Like, I would never follow a cult leader. Like, look at these people. They're so brainwashed, like blah, blah, blah. What if you started thinking about being the kind of person that's like, my kings, my savior. Yes, this is going to bring me out. Like, you are being the brainwashed cult devotee. You're being the person that dons the white robe and moves to the middle of the desert and, you know, kills yourself wearing white Nikes or whatever else they do. That is like that's like a brainwashed. That's like a method of like brainwashing yourself, because one of the things you hear live players say all the time is, this was my time to triple up. This was my moment. This was my savior, like he said. And that kind of thinking can absolutely be is like the key, is like the first step in I think not being able to detect fortune reversal. Can I bring up another? I think this is really interesting, like these modes of fortune reversal. So can I bring up what I feel like is the next mode?
Sure.
Like, if we say like the bottom mode is you have queens and the flop comes out king, ace, whatever, or like you have ace, king, you don't hit. Okay. Here's the next mode. You're in the small blind, you have pocket jacks. Okay. The cutoff opens, the button raises, you that would be what, a 4-bet, you 4-bet
Cold 4-bet, yeah.
to, yeah, there'd be a cold 4-bet, button jams. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Button is really tight. You haven't seen button do anything out of line for the session. You understand that this isn't a squeeze bluff from button. And you are now, I'm sorry, not from button, I'm sorry, big blind, from big blind. And you, and it
Sorry,
folds
so
around
big
to
blind
you.
jams after you cold 4-bet.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Mm-hmm.
So now it folds back to you and you have jacks.
Yeah, this is the easiest fold I've ever heard about. Please fold the hand, Melissa, instantly.
Absolutely. But my point is, it's easy, right? From the perspective of like cold light of day podcast language. Again, a situation where you're stuck, where you think this is a situation where my jacks are not as good as I thought. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, obviously it'd be different if it was kings or aces, obviously. But the reason I said jacks is because I feel like that's maybe somewhat of a threshold.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's a situation that would, I mean, maybe not. You seem to maybe think it's an easy fold, but do you think that that's a little bit tougher than pocket queens? I think king and ace on the flop.
Well, it depends what happens, what the action sequence is. I definitely think it's tougher than like you c-bet an ace king X flop with queens and like a guy jams on you in a live game. I think like queens is like an easier fold there than jacks is in this situation. I guess easy fold, this is where we need to be really careful with our terminology, because easy fold can refer to the subjective experience of how easy or difficult it is for you to bring yourself to fold a spot or to figure out that a spot is a fold, or it can refer to the objective truth about how much EV is lost by calling, and therefore how much better zero is than that, and how much better it is to fold than to call. So when I say easy fold, I don't mean to like undermine anyone or disrespect anyone or say like, if you call there, you're an idiot. What I mean is that it's not close technically at all. Like it's much better to fold than it is to do anything else there. And you're talking about like double digits EV swing in the real world in a live game there, particularly when you're deep. You're actually talking about an EV swing of probably like 40 or 50 big blinds if you're 200 big blinds deep there in like a 1-2 game or something, and that happens. You're talking about very big swings. So it's not close, and it's an easy fold based on the objective truth of the matter. However, yeah, if you're sat there, you've had a few drinks, you're card dead, you're restless, you've had a bad day, you're stuck a couple of buy-ins, this is not how you hoped your night would go, you pick up the jack, so here we go, paint, haven't even seen one paint card for an hour, haven't seen two paint cards for 2 hours, haven't seen a pair for 3 hours, then I can see how it happens, and I can see how the mode 2 thinking, which is the coercive, manipulative, inner demonic creature that wants to strive towards a destructive outcome to satisfy some urge, some hedonistic urge, that creature is very, very tricky and can formulate arguments or can latch on to mode 3 thinking, which is the logical argument-making part of the brain, and can manipulate it and use it to its advantage, because the conscience, as it were, or like the decision maker, the kind of judge within the brain, is going to need some form of logical persuasion in order to call here, right? It's not just going to go, all right, cool, you want your money back? Yeah, go for it, mate. Approved. Put your money in. It's not going to do that. Instead, it's going to go, what is your logical evidence? And the mode 2 thoughts are going to go, well, how can I sneakily and snakily convince the judge that this money should go in? They'll say something like, well, they could have ace king. Jax is a 56% favorite against ace king off, so we should put the money in. Imagine they had ace king and you folded. In fact, is it not true that if they had aces, they would have made a smaller 5-bet? Is it not true that they just usually have ace king?
Yeah.
In fact, I put them on ace king. That's it. I put them on ace king offsuit. Even ace king suited probably would have made a smaller 5-bet. And now all of a sudden, you've got this completely delusional, hallucinated view of the spot in which you're saying, they have ace king a lot, so I can call. And it's just false. But because you've done it in little sneaky increments, you've been able to convince the judge. And the judge is like, well, I really do want to call here, so okay then, approved. Your argument is convincing. The point is that in order to make a big blunder like that your A-game you, your out-of-game you, podcast language you, as you put it, knows is a blunder, you have to be sneaky and you have to manipulate yourself. So, Melissa, when you used to come to me with hands in coaching, where you made like, let's call a spade, egregious mistakes back in the day, right? Really egregious calls sometimes. I would say, man, this is such a shame because she's playing so well for the most part, and then this one session comes up and she does this ludicrous thing that undoes all the hard work, and it was frustrating. But you didn't do that because you just wanted to. You're not the kind of person that's going to sit there and be like, well, I really want to call, so fuck all the logic. Let's just call. Let's go. YOLO. Put it in. YOLO. You're not Nick Airball. You're not standing up and screaming YOLO and putting the money in. He's probably done that. Don't know that he's done that for sure. Don't assume he's probably done that. But you weren't doing that. What you would say is, well, let me spin a narrative because you're good at weaving stories, right? That's your thing. You used to write, blah, blah, blah. So you would spin a narrative like, well, he thinks that I think that this is going on. And in relation to that, he's then going to do this. And it was very like detailed. And then the judge in your head would be like, well, that's a good story. Approved. So we always have a snaky, manipulative mechanism for convincing the inner judge that a mistake is okay. Pay attention to what yours is, guys, if you're listening to this. Next time you're in a fortune reversal spot, don't just think about how untenable it feels to fold and how it's just out of bounds entirely, but look at what your brain's doing. Look at all the deceit. Look at all the way it's trying to convince you and coerce you not to fold. What lies is it spinning? What kind of things is it exaggerating? What is it sweeping under the rug? Your mode 2 thinking is absolutely devious, and it will create not just desire-based urges to do things, but excuses, pseudo-logical excuses to do things as well. We talk about this a lot in poker therapy, the pseudo-logical faculty that comes up with nonsense excuses that don't need to be convincing. They need to be convincing enough while you're in a state of temporary blindness, because that's the state you're in. We've talked about the tunnel vision. We've talked about the blinkers, the quote-unquote temporary autism, to quote Malcolm Gladwell, the author in his book Blink, talks about this. It's a situation where you are only focused on what's directly in front of you because you're in this panic-stricken state of fight or flight. And when you're in that state, you're susceptible to the scammer on the phone telling you to read out your card details. You're susceptible to the mode 2 thinking, telling you your opponent's range is ace-king offsuit. And that's how you punt. So it's really important to understand the full mechanism of punting in order to avoid punting in these fortune reversal spots.
Yeah. I think that the really devious thing about fortune reversal too is that it is that moment of temporary blindness. It is that moment of that tunnel vision that sucks you in and does create these narratives. But it also puts you in this position where you have to accept the fact that you may be wrong if you fold. So for instance, even if I can't think of an example now, but if you're in a situation where you feel like, okay, this is, my aces are cracked here, my kings have been cracked, this is not working. At least this is how I think. Even if I recognize all of the elements of the fortune reversal situation are there, and that I am in a fortune reversal node, and that this is perhaps even a clear fold, there is always the element that you fold, villain turns over a bluff, villain turns over, something that you're just completely misreading the situation. And you have to be okay with that. And you have to also be able to tell yourself, internally that you made the right move with the information you had at the moment, and that you're proud of yourself anyways. And I think this is like a good example of like, we talked about, I think way back at the beginning of the podcast, this idea of being nice to yourself, being treating yourself as you would a friend or a loved one, not beating yourself up. I think part of what drives these fortune reversal, the agony of a fortune reversal spot, is this situation where you are now in a fight or flight mode, and that the flight is not just the flight that brings you away from danger. It's the flight that brings you away from danger, and then you were told that that situation was not dangerous. It was in fact intensely profitable. And so I think that it always sucks to be shown a bluff. And we've talked about on this podcast, like, how to deal with being bluffed, and I would encourage people to listen to that episode if this is something that, you deal with and you're interested in. But there's being bluffed in normal run-of-the-mill spots that are close, or that, maybe are a little bit, that are different. And then there's being bluffed in those kinds of very high pressure fortune reversal type spots where you just know, like, for instance, if villain in the hand that I brought up at the beginning of this episode, with the eights, if villain had really agonized over that and thought to himself, I have to fold a boat here. And then let's just say I was bluffing. Let's say if I was a maniac and I was bluffing
A
in that
whole new
spot.
level of maniac to run that bluff, but yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. What if I brought that one to you, Pete, in a coaching session? This is what I did. I bluffed on the river.
I thought he would have to
I was
fold an
repping
ace.
kings.
I thought
I
he'd
was
have to fold an
repping
ace.
kings.
Yep.
Yeah. I had no choice. So had he folded and I showed a bluff, like living with that, dealing with that, like you have to be able to tell yourself that you did the best you could in that spot. Because if you know that you will treat yourself well after you're shown a bluff, it makes it a little bit easier to respond soberly to the fortune reversal spot.
Yes.
If that makes
This
sense.
is a great point, yeah.
Yeah.
So part of the reason that we don't fold in fortune reversal spots that are actually objectively clear folds, but real struggles inwardly, is that we know there's going to be a lot of suffering either way. Like, we know if we call and lose, there's going to be a load of suffering. But then if we fold, there's going to be loads of suffering as well. It's not clear to us in that moment that the suffering that happens after we fold is any less bad than the suffering that happens after we call and lose. And then on the call branch, you have this prospect, however faint it may be, that glimmer that you might actually just win. So it's a no-brainer to really, as the emotional decision here, the emotional puzzle, it's a no-brainer to choose call, because at least that only sometimes or only usually results in misery, whereas fold always results in misery. And this is the sort of the fake kind of wager that it's like almost like this bizarre version of Pascal's wager for the poker player, where like you just live your life by calling because either way it will suck if you, it's like the inverse or something of Pascal's wager. I don't know, it's not even that related, but it's reminding me of it in some way. There's something about the logic that just like reminds me, and that it's really difficult to actually override that. And one of the ways I think we could get way better at that is like, well, what is the nature of the suffering of folding? Who is inflicting the suffering when we fold? Because when we call, we can see where most of the suffering is coming from. Some of it comes from us, like, you idiot, you should never have, what were you thinking? Why have you gone ahead and thrown away your stack here when you didn't have to? But some of it comes from variance as well. It's like, well, I'm unlucky, I ran into, pocket kings when I had 8x there. Like, that's a horrendous beat. It comes from the external. Like, that's easy to understand. But with the suffering of folding, where does it really come from? If you like trace your inner monologue after that, what are you going to say? You're going to say, well, what if? What if I shouldn't? Was that too tight? Was that too nitty? Was it too passive? Are my friends going to like mock me when I tell them about this hand? Should I even tell anyone about this hand? That sort of thing. The curiosity, it just doesn't sleep. That kind of self-torment, that's all coming from you. All of that is coming from you, nobody else. So it may well be a great solution to actually say to yourself, how will I process this with myself if I fold? How will I treat myself if I fold? What are some things I could do to treat myself fairly? Well, a good question that arises there is, well, why did you fold? I folded because I strongly suspected that I couldn't call, that it was better to fold than to call. Okay, great. So you fold because you think fold is better than call, and yet you're going to react with condemnation to yourself for doing that. So you're going to beat yourself up for behaving as you should behave in poker, just because you closed the door on the glimmer of hope. The lottery ticket, the cultish wander into the desert, wherever it may be, the faint chance that you'd win. And yes, you absolutely need to see in advance that you are programmed to react in that paranoid, irrational, self-deprecating way when you do the right thing. And maybe if you can change that and say, well, next time I make a fold, I'm going to just simply ask myself, was that done with conviction? Is a key question. And if the answer is yes, it was done with conviction, then it's like, well, good for you. You should be proud of yourself. You acted with a ton of courage in a spot where not many people would. You ran into the burning building and you saved the child from burning, where not many people would have the stones to do that. You jumped into the lake after that old woman that fell into the lake. You acted heroically. It's yourself that you're actually saving in that case, but it's still, there's some truth to the expression hero fold. There's some real truth to that, because you have to be a hero. You have to act in a courageous way where most people can't to make that fold. So if you make a hero fold, good for you. If you were wrong, still good for you, because you had the courage to do something that not many people can do. There's way more, it's far more admirable to fold in big pots where you've invested lots of money when you have a big hand than it is to call off the rest of your stack or bluff off the rest of the stack when you've started bluffing or anything like that. So think ahead.
And there's interesting ways that people excuse themselves into behaving irrationally or to behaving irresponsibly. I think so much of being like a solid player, being a winning player, is discipline. So just like anything else, like you want to get into shape, you want to learn a new skill, whatever, like it takes a lot of discipline, it takes sacrifice. We've talked about that many times on the show, the idea of refusing to be a hedonist, saying no to what's immediately available in exchange for greater goods down the line. All of these things, you have to have that level of thinking. But what's interesting to me is when other players excuse what they know to be irrational and hedonistic behavior. And one of the ways this happens is you'll hear them say things like, well, if you got it, you got it, I call.
Yeah.
And that is like, in my opinion, like a great example of that, because it's this kind of attitude of like, well, I'm not going to think through the situation logically. I'm not going to arrive at I'm not going to do the work I need to do to get me to a place of making the best decision, the highest EV play. I'm going to just say, well, if I'm out of luck, I'm out of luck.
Yep.
And I'm not saying that is never appropriate. I think there are times when perhaps that hand where I had, where the guy river to Jack Deuce and had to bet your full house.
Mm-hmm.
There are times when you just have to accept that if you're beat, but you're not folding because there's so much money in the pot, you have so much equity, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But my point is that allowing ourselves these little excuses, these little shortcuts, these little ways of not holding ourselves accountable is I think a bad habit to get into,
mm-hmm.
because what that means is that on the flip side, when we do get into those spots where we have to make the hero fold and we have to treat ourselves well, even if we're wrong, we're not able to do it.
Yeah.
And I think those two things are related,
yep.
if that makes sense. Yeah.
It's a bit like the alcoholic or something like that, right? Like it takes loads and loads of courage to say, man, I feel like shit. I drank loads last night again. I want to drink again today because it will temporarily make me feel better. But I'm not going to. I'm going to choose to suffer in the long term in order that my relationships with my family and my friends and my loved one, my spouse, improve, and that I'm healthier and I have a higher life expectancy and all of those long-term goals, that kind of self-care. Mm-hmm. And I think it's exactly the same thing when it comes to saying something like, well, if you got it, you got it. Like, maybe I could deliberate whether this is a fold or not, but I'm not going to, because the weight is too big, the burden is too great, and the struggle that I have been asked to partake in is beyond my capabilities or what I'm willing to actually embark on right now. It's like saying, yeah, I could lift that weight if I really tried and I really wanted to, probably, but that's not reasonable for me to try. It's a bit too much for me to want to try. So I'm just going to take that drink. I'm just going to go back around the spiral. I'm just going to continue to normalize not thinking in fortune reversal spots because it's easiest not to. It's an addictive thing. It's a hedonistic thing. It's an expedient thing. We've talked about it a lot. Yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it, actually, as a closing statement, is that when we give in to fortune reversal, when we say this spot is just too much of a travesty for me to react well to, we're basically getting wasted at the funeral, and then for another week we're kind of lamenting on the tragedy that's happened in a way where we're saying, this is too great a monster for me, I choose to roll over onto my back and submit my life and just give up to it and do that repeatedly, than actually try to summon the courage to fight it. But in the end, things are always way better when we fight instead of just submitting there, and we always have more capacity and ability to survive against these threats than we think we do. So if you do slow down and you do accept that your hand has now been demoted to a bluff catcher, and you at least open the door to deliberation and say, do you know what? I am courageous enough to deliberate. I'm not saying I'm going to fold here. I'm not saying that I'm going to make a hero fold, but I have the courage to look reality in the eye and say, okay, this is what you are. This is the kind of thing I'm dealing with here. Let me actually embark on the logical quest here. If you can do that, at least you open the door to maybe being able to fold. Okay, maybe the coercive logic of your wanting to win the pot and your pot attachment still wins out, but hey, you got a step closer to actually finding that fold. You did the deliberation. You opened the door to reality instead of just saying, nah, whatever's on the other side of that door, it's probably too great a struggle for me, so let me just give up, and then at least I don't need to feel bad about the fact that I'm still in a losing struggle. It's better to give up than it is to be in a hopeless struggle, right? That's where the psychology of giving up comes in. So I do think when Old Man Coffee goes, well, you either got it or you don't, He's basically just saying, I'm a feeble old man coffee and I don't have any ability to fight against the demon that's at the other side of that door, even though it's like a little tiny shitty demon that you could just kick out the way. He's like a pathetic old man coffee, and he's just going to roll over and call off with Pocket Kings on a 4-liner because it's Pocket Kings or whatever it may be. Old men coffees make the stupidest calls in like big pots when they're attached sometimes.
Oh, God.
They might wait 4 hours to play a hand and then not be able to fold aces in like the worst situation imaginable. It's actually hilarious. But yeah, look on the other side of the door at least. At least look at what it's like. Start the deliberation. It'll be a bit painful. It'll be really unpleasant. But you know what? It'll be like doing a really good workout. Like you'll feel a bit of suffering at the time, but when you're through that deliberation, you're going to feel like, man, that was a mental sweat. I folded there. I embraced the struggle and I fought and I lifted all those weights, and now I'm exhausted, but I'm in a good way, and I'm going to sleep tonight. I'm going to walk out here with my head held high.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to end it for today. This has been a really interesting topic. I'm glad I brought it up.
Did we stick to the roadmap for once? Like, did we actually like
I think
not
we
deviate?
did.
Wow.
We stick to the roadmap. We were supposed to end today at 15:47, and it is exactly 15:47. I don't know what that time means, but I was told at the beginning of this episode that is our cutoff time for today.
Yeah, so 15, the 15th hour is where you do like the military parade march with the flag and stuff like that. The 16th hour is when you go in and clean the mess hall, and the 17th hour is when you have tea with no milk. There's no milk in the mess hall.
Sounds like cult activity to me.
Well, you'd be interested in it. I'll make a documentary about it for you so that you can watch tonight.
Good, thanks. I'll put it on my Netflix queue, which I don't watch because I spend my nights playing poker.
Yeah.
Anyways, all right. Thanks everyone for listening to this episode. We hope that if you enjoyed hearing this and you like what we're doing, you can please like and subscribe in all the podcast platforms. And if you're in our Discord, we'll love the conversation, love the chat. So
yeah, leave us a comment in Discord, leave us a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and do like and subscribe and comment on YouTube. We do read all of your comments, especially shout out to Scott, who has been commenting on our YouTube videos for a long time, writing really in-depth reviews of them. There's a few others as well. Will has done a lot of that as well. I get the sense that while not that many people maybe listen to the podcast or watch the podcast compared to some of the other content we do, the people who like this show are really hooked on it. And I actually had, like I said to you, Melissa, people come up to me and say, oh, Poker Distilled is so good, like when I was in London and stuff like that. So the people who like this show do really like it, and we appreciate all of the feedback. It helps inspire us to keep coming back here and, you know, having these really boring, tedious conversations. We don't actually like each other at all, so we do need that in order to show up to this job.
It's painful. We do the work because
for you guys,
we don't have a choice. Yeah,
because we love you. For you. All right, guys. On that note, we'll see you back here for episode 20 of Poker Distilled next week. Bye for now.